And welcome everybody, and good evening or good morning or good afternoon or good night at this new virtual DDD. And we are joined here by a whole bunch of people. And today we actually have a special guest facilitator. It's Steve Took. And Steve, it's up to you now.
Hey, thanks, Kenny. Hi, I'm Steve Took. I'm one of the co-founders at Cucumber Limited, and I'm now working as a product manager for our Cucumber Studio product. But I'm joined today here by a whole bunch of people who've got lots of things that they want to talk to you about on the intersection of UX research, behavior-driven development, and domain-driven design. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around and ask everyone to introduce themselves and give a one-sentence summary of who they are. So I'm going to start. I'm just going to go around the list that I've got on my screen. So I'm going to kick off with Jabe.
Hi, I'm Jabe Bloom. I work for Red Hat, the Global Transformation Office, and I am getting my PhD in design from Carnegie Mellon University.
Dawn?
Hi, I'm Donna Hukana. I'm currently in Munich in Germany. I work for IBM, and I'm a design principal, but previously was a data architect and technical architect, and started my career as a chemist. So happy to be here.
Rob?
Yeah, my name's Rob Meany. I'm from Ireland. I work for a little startup here in Ireland called GlowFox. So I work specifically in quality engineering, looking at testability, designing systems with testability and operability in mind. So I've done a lot of work in those areas. So interested from that perspective.
Great. And Rebecca?
Yeah, I'm Rebecca Wurzbrock. Have had a long experience in object design back in the days when designing was not so segregated into different areas. So the work that I did influenced people who founded and started domain-driven design. Currently, I consult people on architecture and design, and also work part-time for the Agile Alliance, running their experience reports program.
Sam?
Hey, I'm Sam Hatoum. I'm a BDD coach and consultant by day, and I'm a startup founder at all other times. I'm working on a product called Expex, which bridges the gap between business and technology, and I consult a lot with the automotive industry right now.
Goiko?
Hi, I'm Goiko. I'm mostly programming my own product now. In my previous life, I did a lot of consulting with banks and other large orgs on Agile when that was popular.
John?
My name is John Cutler. I work for a company called Amplitude that's product analytics. I have a background in UX research and product management.
Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Rayner, and I contributed to a book on behavior-driven development with Richard Lawrence that was published in the last 12 months. And I'm an independent consultant, spending most of my time doing DDD training and coaching. And I also run the Explore DDD conference in the US in September.
Right. Matt? We can't hear you, Matt. Seb?
What Matt is. But I'm a BDD advocate with SmartBear. I got acquired as part of the acquisition of Cucumber.
Am I there now?
You are.
Right, yeah. I'm a programmer by trade. I got pulled into the BDD community by sort of just mutual values and interests about 10 or 11 years ago. Wrote a book about Cucumber, started a company, Now we recently got acquired by Smart Bear. So I'm a professional know-it-all is the way I describe it now. I get paid to kind of write and share what I know. And I've spent a lot of time training and coaching teams in BDD.
And last but not least, Indy.
And I will unmute myself first. Hi. I have no idea why you guys are growing cucumbers. I don't know what BDD is, but I know Dawn and she invited me. I am a software design researcher and I do qualitative design research in the problem space. And I'm leading the effort to try to get more and more people interested, not in user research, but in research about how people pursue their purposes so that we can do a better job of creating software for a lot of different approaches, different philosophies than we're familiar with, different thinking styles, different contexts. And the only way to do that is to look at things outside your own perspective and outside the perspective of your services. And I guess I do a lot of training and coaching. I've written 2 books. I was one of the founders of Adaptive Path.
Fantastic, thank you. So the way I'd like to start this off is this whole virtual meetup panel was kicked off by a tweet by John a few weeks ago now. And I wondered, John, if you could give us a quick overview of what inspired that tweet and why you've caused this confluence of people.
Sure. First, I think this is amazing. It's like my hero is like in one place. So I think this is incredible. I can tell you the specific story about what inspired this. I sort of sit between product management and UX research, and usually I'm sort of like the developer's product manager. They say that I get them. I tried software. I tried programming before, but I was so obsessed by it that I had to forcibly not do it because it would run my life, and I wasn't very good at it. But what inspired this tweet is I was actually facilitating an activity. So the company that I work at, Amplitude, does analytics, but it's sort of behavioral analytics. So it's sort of deep behavioral analytics about how people are using products. And I have a background in qualitative and quantitative UX research and product management. And so I try to learn new activities. And I actually started experimenting with doing event storming and event modeling as an activity, primarily because part of our company, we need people to instrument their products. They need to instrument the behavior in their products. And so I needed a new and interesting way to get at that problem and to engage a cross-functional group of people in that activity, because if it was just the sort of business owner, they only got part of it. And so I started getting involved in event modeling and event storming activities, self-taught by videos that some of the people on this call have done and other folks. And I experienced something really amazing, is that I started inviting designers into this process. And of course, it always felt natural what we were doing to me, but there would be UX researchers and they say, well, this is almost exactly like blank, except not exactly like it. It's just a little different. And then to the developers in the room, I would say, well, folks, it is kind of like a lot of UX research activities that we might do. We might do participatory design or do field studies or different activity, different sort of techniques that we do in UX research, basically sense-making activities. And this is very similar to those. And developers would say, oh, wow, it is similar, but it's missing this. It's missing this technical component that is valuable to us. And it was a really profound experience where I realized it's a classic situation where there's a lot for everyone to learn, I think, from these different groups. I mean, I think it's very valuable for the DDD and BDD community to maybe understand these other approaches, like Indy's work with sort of mental models and different things is exactly what we're doing. We're making sense of things together in a group of people and aligning this around human beings and their needs and their behaviors and what they want. And similarly, I thought from the UX angle and UX research angle, this gave an incredibly powerful way to get involved more deeply in what was happening. The fact that your work could inform architecture and could inform really big design decisions that were happening, you know, from an architectural standpoint and a software development standpoint. I thought that was profound. And the more I talked to people about it, they thought it was kind of interesting as well. So that was the inspiration for the tweet. And I think Andy Budd the other day, who's a designer in England, and he runs UX London and ClearLeft, he reminded me that communities tend to circle the wagons when they're threatened, but internally they talk shit about each other all the time. So one thing he cautioned me with this is that you know, it's sometimes the UX research community and agile communities or software development communities have outwardly sort of antagonized each other a little bit, but I think I'm excited about getting a group of people together in a safe setting and talk about these concepts in an open way. And that was really the motivation. Hopefully that helps, Steve. And I'm excited I just want to check it out and listen. There's so many great people on the call.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it too. Since we started talking, I just want to bring Michael and Frederick in. So Michael, if you could give us a quick one sentence introduction, that would be great.
Oh, hi, Michael Wolf, formerly of Seattle. I was headed to Australia and I'm now in North Carolina. Haven't seen Jabe since the original Lean Coffee table in Seattle, and Rebecca at Agile Open Northwest. So it's interesting seeing what's happening in North Carolina, Research Triangle.
Strong, sticky game you got going there.
It's how I run my life.
And Frederick?
Hello there, I'm Frederick Matheson. I help run the IXDA Oslo group here in Oslo, Norway. I work at a consultancy called Beck, where we are working on something we call continuous design, where we sit very closely designers and developers and researchers and product managers together. So really eager to learn a lot from what everyone here has to share. I'm really grateful that John kicked it off in this kind of way, in this kind of conversation, because in a lot of cases, everyone just ends up arguing with each other. So it's nice to have coffee.
Great. Okay, so I think one thing we really need to do to start with is just, for the purposes of this conversation at least, for the next hour or so, it would be great to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So is there someone who'd like to give me a quick definition of UX research? Indy, go.
Unmute myself. So UX research is mostly about trying to understand whether what we have created from a service point of view, whether it involves software or people talking or what have you, but holistically, is it doing the job that we had hoped it would do for people? People refer to it as users because users are people who have a relationship to an organization or a potential relationship. They might be people who are not already users. They also like to use other nouns than the word user, such as customer or member or passenger of an airplane or whatever noun, right? And there's also more to it. We think of it in the solution space in terms of generative and evaluative. I've got a really cool diagram I can pop up at some point if you guys want to see it all hanging together. We have qualitative, we have quantitative, and then we also have problem space research, which is sort of the new area now that we've got a lot of techniques for research within the solution space, within both generative and evaluative, within both qualitative and quantitative. Does that help? Do you want the diagram? Okay, I'm seeing yes on the diagram. Let me grab that up real quick. Somebody else can chat while I grab this up.
Well, so while you're grabbing that diagram, maybe someone would like to volunteer to give us a definition of BDD, behavior-driven design.
Fine.
Matt.
Business-driven design, Steve.
Is that what I said?
No, he said behavior-driven design. So it's an evolution of test-driven development. And test-driven development, if you don't know what it is a practice where programmers, when they're writing code, before they write any solution, they write an automated test that says what they want the code to do next. And because the code doesn't do that thing yet, it fails. And that automated test then provides them with guidance that they can use to drive out to develop their solution. And it provides you with kind of like safe guide rails to develop your solution. What went wrong a bit with test-driven development is that it became a kind of quite an engineering technical practice, and it's really useful for engineers to use. But actually, some of us realized that it's also really useful if you're about to sit down and write a program to first think about, what do I want the program to do? And if you can write that automated test in a way that you can share it with someone who can't read or write code, but maybe wants the program to do something, it can become a sort of that test can become an artifact where you and the person who wants the program to do something but can't make it do it themselves, you and that person can communicate and discuss and negotiate about what you're going to make it do, what exactly it is they want it to do. So behavior-driven development became this kind of evolution of test-driven development, where we really, really focused on expressing those automated tests in a way that could be read and then discussed with the users or stakeholders or customers or whatever we want to call them, the people that want the program. And it's really kind of especially focused around specific examples, because each one of those automated tests is going to be a specific example of, in this situation, this is what I want the program to do. So the way we write those examples, and then we can use them as these kind of, anthropologists call them boundary objects, like the thing that you can use between two different cultures as a sort of meeting point. So the examples become those boundary objects.
Cool.
How's that?
Rebecca, you've got your hand up.
You mute though.
Okay, let's unmute. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say is that behavior-driven development and test-driven development came out of the desire, if you will, to have an understanding outside of the thing that you're building of what it is. And that actually it is something that's fairly important. It isn't just embodied in the thing that you're making, but actually a specification. Now, some people go, well, it's just examples. It's not specifying everything, with behavior-driven development, but it is an example-driven way of getting touch points between the thing that you're building and its expectations that you can observe. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. And I think I feel like that segues really nicely into a definition of domain-driven design. Is there someone who'd like to pick that up for me?
I'll have a crack at it. So domain-driven design is an approach to software design that was originally coined by Eric Evans in his seminal book. And it's the idea of, when you're dealing with a complex business problem, that you produce a model that you express in the software. And you do that in a collaborative way with the people that are the experts on whatever that business domain happens to be. So it's technical experts and business experts working together to develop a shared model. And related to that, some common ground between domain-driven design and behavior-driven development is the emphasis on the importance of language and having a shared language between people that are on the business side and on the technical side. And then related to that is the role of examples as a way of guiding what a model needs to do and what kind of cases it needs to happen. So those specific scenarios, that would be that. Now there's a bunch of other related things in domain-driven design, evolving set of practices and patterns that have gone along with that, including what John had mentioned earlier, like event storming and other practices that have come about. But that's kind of it in a nutshell, is exploring models together, expressing those in code, and focusing your design effort where it really matters.
Cool, thank you. I can see a hand up from Goiko.
So, hello. Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing that I recently stumbled upon while reading Hacker News somebody posted an article, I guess from 80s or something like, by Peter Nauer, who talked about how programming is akin to building a theory about the world. And I think that very nicely kind of ties up all these three things together, because I'm pasting a link to the article in the chat. It's a fascinating read, and it really clarifies a lot of stuff, because really when we're doing UX research, or when we're doing examples for BDD, or when we're trying to kind of create a model of the domain, we're trying to build a theory about something else in the world. And then I guess the big question is how well that model starts aligning or disaligning with what actually happens in the real world. That's basically me. So,
and what
Rebecca
people are trying to get done. Sorry, yeah, what actually happens, and what people are trying to do. yeah. I have some things to say, but you're going to point to Rebecca.
Well, I just remembered what Rebecca was saying reminded me of this brilliant book I've got on my shelf by David West. It's called Object Thinking, and he talks about it. There's this quote from this book. He says, if you can model when you're writing software, if you can model the problem well enough, the solution will take care of itself. And that's just an object-oriented design thinking. But I think it seems to me that's the thing that all three of us have got in common, is this idea of wanting to just really understand the problem space in order to be able to build great solutions.
I'm all wiggly with excitement here, because I have not done object-oriented programming since we'll say the 80s, when I actually got to learn from Grady Booch, which was hilariously fun. So this is so cool, because it looks like this is the direction that everybody went, and it's become more codified and more reliable, right? Repeatable. I went off in the other direction of the person's side, and we can put these together fairly easily. They can match up and become, better together, peanut butter and chocolate. Super exciting. Do you guys want to see that little diagram that I was talking about?
Yeah.
I didn't want to share my screen while everybody was talking. That would be rude. So I will do that right now real quick. This is the diagram where all it does is talk about design research, data collection techniques. And what I'm hearing from you is that there are also model building techniques. So there might be data collection from that I can somehow paste on here. In the solution space, which is where we talk about users, there's generative, which is research that helps us decide what to create and how to create it, and evaluative, which is research that is like that initial DDD, I think, or maybe TDD, where you're figuring out a test and you're failing it. And you're trying to see if you're hitting certain metrics, so people make up the metrics. Foundational or exploratory work is more along the lines of problem space, which is where you're trying to understand what a person's actual purpose is, not before they even come reaching for what you're creating. And that is the area that we're exploring now in more depth, just starting to. People are really getting excited about it, both within the UX and the product manager realm. This is how I put the generalized labels on it for user UX research versus big data versus usability versus opportunity or futures. Kenneth Bowles wrote Future Ethics, which is a great book. And I don't have my bookshelf here, so I would hold it up for you. This is also another way of looking at solution space versus problem space, where the question? I thought I heard something. Where the solution space is, it can contain whatever process, whether you're doing agile or jobs to be done or continuous dual track or whatever other flavors there are. The work that we do in the problem space has more to do with figuring out strategy, figuring out actual people's thinking styles so that you can figure out much better scenarios for them, figuring out gaps, doing better metrics to set, which would be set on people's purpose rather than whether the model that we made is being met. And I don't think I'm saying that right. I think the models that I come up with are mental model diagrams and thinking styles together. And then this is a mental model diagram where it's showing just people's thinking as they're trying to pursue a purpose. And then this is a mental model diagram with capabilities aligned underneath, so that now we can do a gap analysis with respect to how well we're supporting people's purpose or how well we're supporting certain thinking styles. And then we can start filling in the gaps or strengthening the weaknesses. And I think this bottom part, because we do it, I've got all sorts of examples of this here. We do it in a lot of different ways, and we sometimes throw in competition. We can throw the models in here. I have had people use these mental model diagrams for software architecture. So that's as far as I'm going to take you, unless you have some questions. Thank you.
So I can see Dawn's got her hand up. Do you want to come in now, Dawn?
Yeah, so I always think about, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted Indy here, because I think what she's really beautifully done is everyone's always focused on doing and creating. We can't help ourselves. Even if we've got a problem, then already we're suggesting, because it's shorthand for us to say, this is what's been done before and tried, and the probability is quite high that that's probably going to work. And even if it's not, it's a data point to fail on, and then you kind of know, like that gap thing that Andy was showing at the bottom of her diagram, you know what you're missing. So I think of problem space as in, this is the anatomy of a person's motivation. If you really understand that, then you can take whatever solution patterns, blueprints, whatever you know, and even if you don't know, you will probably hit creating a fantastic or creative or innovative solution because you understand the anatomy of that person's motivation. A lot of times what we do with software design, which is the creating, is like, this is what I have a hammer. So I'm going to find things to hit and use that and try and get that to work. And then we only stop when it doesn't work at all. And then we start to look for other things. So if you folded in this diagram almost into a three-dimensional cube, that's the space we're trying to look at. But a lot of times we look at it flat. And I think what we're now doing is we're all kind of converging at that point or that face on that cube. But some of us have come from BDD, some of us have come from domain-driven design, some of us have come from user research, and we're kind of like, oh, hold on a minute, what's going on here? I'm a designer, I'm an architect, I'm a this, but the problem or the area that we're looking at, the anatomy hasn't changed. What is different and what we think is different is because of our approach, it can only be addressed in a certain way. And I think that's why we're seeing this convergence. Because what I heard everybody say was, we have a system we have to build. There are people who have to build it, and there are people who have to use it. And, you know, sometimes we forget to account for those three. Let's go for it.
So Michael, you have a question for Dawn.
Yeah, Dawn, it was great to hear that discussion. I was wanting to see if you had an example of when you dug into that person's motivation and it changed the focus to what got done and what got created.
I can look for something, Michael, so I'll let other people talk and I'll try and see if I can find an example. So
I've got a bunch of different examples with more coming out all the time as people are using mental model diagrams. One in particular actually hasn't come out yet. It was for an airline. And one of the, whenever we make an airline, we want to fly somewhere, right? We go and have to make a reservation. That's kind of the the model that we all follow. And the reservation process is basically saying, hey, we're a company that has airplanes that fly between airports. So, pick some airplanes and airports on a certain day. But when you go and talk to actual people, they think much different things. And one of the things that happens early on that's never been accomplished by any reservation system is this whole, what does it take to get there? And do I really want to go? Or can I get there another way? That's never been supported. The other thing, there's this one thinking style that's called just get me there. These are the people who have something to do, like I've got to catch that cruise ship, or I've got to be at that meeting, or I need to get in the day before the conference so I can go have a beer with this dude. It's like I want to be there by a certain time, but yet I can't leave here until I'm done with such and such. And I want to just tell you that. And then you tell me 2 or 3 flights that'll work really well for me. It gets lots more complicated from that because we've got all this data on like connecting airports and the weather and delays at those airports at certain times of year that we could layer in. We've got all their past habits that they've been doing with regard to taking flights. So that's an idea of the complexity. The airline has not acted on that yet. And I've not seen anybody like Google or Kayak or Priceline do anything like that. But that's kind of an example where we can all see like, oh yeah, I can think of like a couple different ways that we can support that.
So I can't find the thing I was looking for, but I can describe it. And this is something that personally happened to me. And after this happened, I was listening actually to a podcast of Indies on thinking styles. And I reached out to her the next day because my head exploded. I was working on a project, and today I'm a designer, but previously I was a technical architect. So we were describing a particular need that we had confirmed with our user base that this was required, and we're carrying on and getting it built. And then this was December 2018, just before Christmas, everything blew up because there was an assumption that was made by the development team. And because they didn't have the proof, they just accepted it, didn't state it, didn't share it. And for 3 months, we were completely misaligned, but didn't realize until we now started to build the final system and take what we had designed and look at the software, and it was a mess. So we spent 3 days on the phone, 12 hours a day, trying to go through, unravel all. So we're now at the end of Indy's diagram, the gray section where you have your solution, unravel it all the way back to the foundation, and then put it back together. And that experience is burnt into my brain. And I said, I never, ever, ever want to experience that again. And that could have been prevented with a conversation 3 months before to say, I think it's this. And we'll like work it through and get the evidence and realize that that's not the case, and then continue. So if you think about, you talk about the time continuum and all the threads, we picked the wrong one 3 months ahead. And then we literally had to work our way back in 3 days to the point where we now got to the right inflection and then ran down the other end in order to make our deadline. I never, ever want to repeat that again. So that's my personal story. And I have a diagram that kind of shows that. I just can't find it right now. So that's one example, Michael. I don't know if that helps.
Would you have had that information 3 months prior, or did you need to learn some stuff along the way?
We had the information. We could have confirmed that. This is the thing that made me crazy, because it wasn't a case of, oh, we didn't know what we didn't know. That could have been addressed 3 months prior.
So what's your practice now to when things feel like X, you do Y?
So I don't wait for the feel, because you'll never feel it or detect it because you're not aware of it. So there are a couple of things that I do, which is I take a kind of straw man model of the designed behavior, and I sit with an architect or an engineer, And I say, tell me every single API and every single interaction system point that will support this behavior. Then we start describing, what does this mean? That means I press this button and this is going to happen. Or like in Indy's case, let's take the airline. I want a flight in 15 minutes and I need to get back home on Friday or something, right? So how is that going to get supported? And we literally go through on paper and make sure that there are no gaps, or it's not the gaps that I'm worried about, because if we're ignorant, that's okay. The assumptions I want to flesh out, because they say, oh yeah, it's going to work. How do you know it's going to work? Oh, because we're going to have this data. Well, how long is that going to take? Oh, that will take 1 hour. That's not going to fly because it's got to be 15 minutes or, that sort of thing.
So I'm desperate now to bring Rebecca in. I know Rebecca's been waving and wanting to talk about this.
So yeah, I'm thinking that your understanding of event storming that could be a interesting technique or modeling approach for really understanding what are the important events through the system where people are both part of the system. It's not just the system you're building, it's the events that are flowing through to achieve goals. And event storming is a technique that's, got hatched by Alberto Brandolini in the domain-driven design community. And it kind of takes an approach that says, when we do this sort of modeling, it's not just going with one architect or whatever. We get a collective understanding of a set of informed and intrigued stakeholders, and I guess say stakeholders being architects, being business folks, through in order to understand what are the pinch points or the difficulties and what's the flow through to accomplish what we want to do. And so from that technique, just getting a collective understanding of something that might be a very complex system of people and the events that flow through to accomplish what we want to do is a really powerful modeling technique. So I'm just saying, I think I see that crossover there as something pretty useful that you might consider.
If I can just add, there's something that you said that really resonated, and I think is forgotten all the time. And the system includes people. Everybody's focused on writing the software. It's the software, we're delivering the software. The system is actually the people and what they're doing and the software, and somehow we've kind of forgotten that. And that's sort of, once we've looked at every other variable and we think, what is it that's left? So it's almost by omission, we're getting to that convergence point where it's people. Indy, go for it.
And can I throw something in here as an anecdote? Can you hear me without my phone? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me of somebody went in to model some stuff for some healthcare IT system, and everybody put the diagram up on the wall. I think they were working with the nurses. They had every single system and pill and whatever. They didn't put the patient in. Somebody, at the end, they said, where's the patient in all of this workflow?
So, Indy, I see your hand up, and Jabe too. But John, I think, has got a visual example that we can use to talk through to bring some of this together for everybody. So, if you can just hold your questions until John gives us this. Oh, you're mute, John.
Oh, unmute. There we go. I wanted to give you two quick, interesting, fun examples. Imagine you're a developer, you're in the building, and a customer calls and says, we need to track keys. And you think, oh, well, that's easy. I mean, what are keys for? They're for apartments. You have to show your apartment. So, someone has to go and get a key. Well, you can think of a lot of ways. Well, how are you going to track keys? Well, okay, well, there's a house, and every house has a couple keys, right? I mean, there's only one lock, and you make these assumptions. So as a UX researcher, one of my roles was getting in a van with the whole team and going on site and spending time with customers understanding their mental models. And I always think how amazing this example was. It wasn't until the engineers saw what a key wall looked like. They had heard about this key wall and they thought you just need to track keys in the software. This is a key wall in a property management company. And it wasn't until they understood that the problem was, how are you going to find the key on the key wall? And there's like 7 keys for every place, and some are old and some are changed and some are new and some are ratty and some don't work and some you should only use at 4 p.m. and some you should only use at 10 a.m. But the fascinating part about this is that the company went on a year later. So they didn't do it. You know, they didn't add that random field for key, because the engineers saw that like this, we're not going to solve this right now. But as an intern project, they partnered with a company that does keyless locks, remote keyless locks, that you can unlock something. And they set up a situation where, as a property manager, you could monitor the door with a camera and make sure it is who it wants. And you could just unlock the door easily, and they were able to eliminate the key wall. So that's a good example of where, back to sort of what Indy was saying and how mental models were able to change this, is that if the developers had not gone on site and seen this and had just sort of in a vacuum decided how to address keys, it would have been very, very different. So I always like this example. It's like, until you see the key wall, it's very difficult to understand what having to keep track of keys is all about. And they were able, I don't know, I probably have a picture of us working with large co-design activities. I don't, except, yeah. No, I don't have the picture. But anyway, we go on site with customers, but that's something I think about. I thought that was a fun example.
That is awesome. The one thing that I wanted to say is that, to John's point, I do listening. Listening is the core of data collection. And it's not something that, I can't understand a mental model, which is a collection of a lot of different thinking styles, approaches to a particular purpose, until I've done a lot of listening in a certain realm, a certain way of doing this. It's not a list of questions. It's actually just non-directive. It's called an imic perspective. And what we do is we're building our knowledge from the point of view that we know each person is completely different and coming from within their own frame and from within their own context. And yet the way that we go through the data then afterwards allows us to find, to clearly create puzzle pieces and find the similarities between the puzzle pieces and let, from the bottom up, the puzzle grow into patterns. And that listening at the core is also something I apply to my stakeholders, to everybody on the team, to the other divisions, to people that some people hire me just to do listening sessions with 2 different teams that are having distrust issues between each other. Because they're always, when you get down to it, when you can get to the inner thinking, and you can get to the emotional reactions, and when you can get to the guiding principles, there's so much in common and there's so many patterns that come up. Those patterns then form what we use to walk forward and help those teams understand each other better and then start to collaborate, which is, I think, something that Dawn was saying about the people. And then we talked about the nurses and the pills and no patients and the key wall and taking the guys out there. It's super important to remember that this all happens with listening, a certain kind of listening, deep listening. It's called the empathic mindset. People in psychology or counseling call it empathic listening. And you can train yourself to do it. It is definitely a different kind of hat that you put on. And when you've got that hat on, you can see what's coming out of other people's mouths in a different way, and you can help them get to depth. So that's all I wanted to say, was just that listening is such a key point, and there's no shortcutting it, and there's no shortcutting or automating, trying to understand what somebody was conveying to you. I get that question all the time. Can't we just automate it? The AI can read sentences now. I'm like, no, they can recognize keywords.
So, Rob?
I want to say, oh, sorry. Go on, Steve.
Oh, you go ahead.
Well, you're reminding me. So when you talked about the group therapy thing, Indy, I sometimes like joke about that when I talk to non-software people about what I do. But so often when we go into teams to teach them about BDD or teach them how to use Cucumber, really what we're doing is solving human problems about how the people from the business who have got money and needs, and the people from the technical side, how they're treating each other and how they're working together. And it often seems to come back to that. One of the cool things that we've heard back from teams that have adopted these ideas is that they've talked about them generating empathy. Like one of the side effects of practicing BDD, apparently, according to people who do it, is that it can generate empathy. It helps people to kind of stop blaming each other, and stop finger pointing, because they properly feel like they're working together to try and tackle their shared ignorance, because there's always going to be that ignorance, but sort of leveling everybody up rather than it feeling like an us and them game.
That's lovely. And that idea of feeling heard is so core to our human experience.
So I just wanted to make a point about the people being part of the system, and other people within the business being part of the system too, and the people who build, run and operate the software are part of that system. So as part of mapping exercise we've integrated customer support engineers, different people throughout the business, to try and build their systems to actually enable them to have a great experience as well and understand their needs and build that into the system, rather than focus entirely on our users. We talk about the experience our engineers have, customer support engineers, marketing and all that, and take that empathy and build the systems to, as I said, to optimize for a great engineering experience or operations experience. And that actually has accelerated our ability to deliver value to our users.
Right. Dawn, I think you have a question.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find my Zoom icon. So I was just thinking about what Rebecca said about event storming and where we started. And the thing that strikes me is there's always an unknown quantity and an unknown variable. And that typically is human behavior, because we are not predictable necessarily in a logical way, or it would just break our brains trying to calculate mathematically what those options would be. So is event storming almost like a way, event storming or any other exercise, and I'd like to have some equivalents, a way of reminding us to check the unknown, make space for the things that either we've ignored. So I think the ignored for me is a very personal thing. And I've had conversations with Indy about this so many times, just not stating an assumption or calling them out or checking it. You end up building on sand and it's totally wasted effort. That's one classic failure point for software projects. You go on because you're emotionally invested, and it doesn't matter what anybody says until the thing actually blows up in your face, then that's what I'm going to do. So that's one thing. But the other that I find really interesting is the unaccounted, because we just don't know. As human beings, we're kind of almost, genetically and evolutionarily adapted for that. That's the heart of our adaptability. But then the systems that we produce, which is in our likeness, doesn't do any of that. So that's almost a way of bringing that back in. So ignored assumption, I believe it's going to work based on whatever data, I don't know. But the more interesting one is the unaccounted and learning something new and bringing in that extra variability. So I'm asking the question, is that sort of what event storming is? Because I don't really know a lot about DDD and BDD. So
I can jump in on the event storming part, and Paul add in whenever you can. So the answer there is yes and no. So event storming, the power all comes from perception. It's a way of, it's an unstructured way. So you begin with just simple stickies where everyone can pitch in. And it's all about perception in that matter. And I always say, as the moment you bring in structure, you will lose insights. So you try to withhold from structure to get more insight, but people will get feel a little bit anxious about the chaos, right? So what I've been experimenting lately, my wife's actually a background in anthropology. So I brought her in on one of these event storming sessions and just sit in the back and observe. And she could whisper in my ear in the back what's happening, because her perception, her way of seeing the things behind, they call it the things in between, right? In between the fingers, all the behaviors, she could whisper that in and bring in the perception. However, within event storming, there is a structure at some point where you bring in actors and you bring in different perceptions. So as long as you bring it in, it's a great tool where everyone is free to pitch in. But then again, I have another story where I was with Alberto and in Agile 2019. We've been running a big picture event storming, and we gave everyone a specific role in that part, so different perception. And I saw this woman sitting down somewhere, so I was in the back, so I was facilitating. I was asking, okay, how are you doing? She says, well, I got the role of a user of this part as a client, but nobody's asking me for my perception. So when you talked about we're forgetting the user, that what popped into my mind instantly. But yeah, so I believe event storming is really powerful. Same with example mapping, and I try to combine them. I do combine them both. And the funny thing is, today I gave a training with event storming, and then my domain is going to the cinema because everyone experienced going to the cinema. And as soon as that happens, you see people getting into the conversation because they empathize with the user because, well, they are the user. And so whenever time that happens, so I love the story John told, then you see things happening in event storming without the unstructured part. So I think that is still needed, right? People can go pick event storming and make it a tool for creating event sort systems again and going into the solution space instantly. While the power is there in the problem space with all the perceptions, trying to, what crucial conversation that book says, creating a shared pool of understanding where the stickies will be visualized.
By the way, Kenny, I have a mental model diagram about people who are going to the movies. So
ooh, I want to see that.
Yes, I want to see yours. It's on the website, I think.
Yeah.
It's in the first book, actually. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you say that, because from a design perspective, there's an exercise that we do, which we call big ideas, and that is it's mandatory that you need to. There's a phrase like when you go and watch a movie, suspend your belief, leave that outside the door, and come in. And even physics does not apply, and you start with a generative exercise, almost get loose. And then the thing that I've observed, and I've done hundreds of these, is it's like any first draft, it's terrible. But the reason why it's terrible is it almost acts like a palate cleanser. You get that out of the way, and then you've taken off the head and all the crud and everything. And then the second, the third round, then you're really getting into what people are thinking, what's their motivation. But it's a very it's a very informal way to do that. And by the third time, and you also see the energy in the room go up. And it's not adrenaline energy, it's a different kind. It's almost like there's electricity in the room, and people are creative. And at that point, they're coming up with ideas. Some of them, they know that aren't even doable, and they've really suspended belief. And that sort of seems to open up this particular creative area. And we've got big ideas. And so we start off and we say, okay, you have to generate about 10, 3 of them have to be impossible, and everybody protests. How am I going to come up with an impossible idea? And I'm thinking, you're a human being and you can't come up with an impossible idea. But it's almost like we're constrained, and then you take the shackles off, but it has to be done in cycles. So that's what I was thinking when you were talking about event storming. It almost sounds like that, but it's not exactly the same. So yeah.
Yes. So one thing to add there, what Rebecca's saying, you can start in the problem space like as is, only what's needed, but you can also move into more technical parts, and that's so there are different types, and that makes it for me it makes it a powerful tool to use because everyone can just pitch in and join up.
So I know Jabe has been wanting to come in for a while, so I just want to bring Jabe in now.
Hi guys. So I thought I'd offer just an expansion of what we're describing as design by kind of talking through three cultures that's kind of used in some design thinking. So first culture, or the initial two cultures were described by C.P. Snow in a paper called Two Cultures. So scientific culture and the humanities culture, right? So scientific culture tends to be descriptive of what is. It is an analytic descriptive that describes how things are. And for most people nowadays, they use a kind of a Popperian correspondence theory of truth in order to figure out, is my scientific theory matching what's happening in reality, right? So truth is defined in these really easily as, if we have two theories, whichever theory is closer to explanation of what actually happens when we do an experiment, that's the one that works, right? So not all of BDD is like this, but very much the way that BDD sets up a test and then tests to see whether or not that test is correspondent with the expectations. This is correspondence theory, it's Popperian falsification theory, it's experiment design, right? It's the design of an experiment and the testing of an experiment. It's very interesting, one way of thinking about design, one way of thinking about how things work. The second culture is humanities culture, and humanities cultures tends to be descriptive of how the world is, and how as in the way that humans, that's why it's called the humanities, perceive the world, right? So in this particular case, things like anthropology and observation and listening and all these things become important for documenting how the world is perceived, how it is, what it's like, what's the world like, what's the human experience like. And from a design perspective, this is kind of the problem solution fit thing that people try to do, try to go out and observe how the world is, and then build a solution that fits the way the world is. Yes, this is kind of the idea of like problems as negative space and solutions as fitting into the negative space in the world, right? Fitness for the way the world is. The third way of thinking, the one that a lot of designers have tried to argue should be part of the academy, part of the university, is thinking as design, and it's about how the world could be, or how the world ought to be. And I want to say that this is much different than the previous two, and I'll point to it this way. If you're doing domain-driven development, one of the things that you kind of intuitively know is that the way that you design the model exposes certain possibilities about how the system could be designed or not, right? It actually shapes what's possible. It doesn't say what is, it changes what could be, yeah? And this is a much different way of thinking about design, because it is this interaction where design actually shapes the world. It doesn't interact with the world. It is a loop that feeds back on itself. And this in general is called ontological design. And ontological design is the idea of shaping the way human experience could be in the future, not the way it is, not trying to change or interact with the way it is, but to actually enable new possibilities, to open possibilities in the world. And so, really kind of quickly, I think we've seen in this conversation, the first two, again, a little bit of kind of the way that BDD interacts with a kind of scientific Popperian theory of design. And we've seen the second one from Dawn and Indy, at least the way that I've heard them talk so far, as being a very much of a humanitarian anthropological interaction with design. And the thing that I think is really important to keep open and to kind of constantly re-explore is this third way of thinking about design, this way in which the way that we make stickies, the way that we make event storming, the way that we make mental models, all these things actually feed back on themselves and create possibilities of what could come. Yeah. And so I think that's really, I wanted to make sure that we kept that last space open for discussion.
I would say that that's my holy grail, is to introduce the world to that third space.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah. These opportunities are here, and there is a lot. I'm using humanities to help people understand that there are different perspectives or
That's
perceptions out there. Yeah.
And I think the critical thing for the other, like, kind of little critical thing about the conversation that I have right now that I'm a little kind of angsty about. We keep on talking about understanding or how things are or is, or these kind of like permanent, non-plastic ways of describing how we perceive the world, or that the world is static, or that mental models are static, or that it's a good thing that everyone has the same perception. I think that common ground, which is a concept that says it's like minimum viable conceptual overlap, as opposed to maximum conceptual overlap, right? And so there's this idea, there's two ideas, like requisite variety, meaning that a system that's going to address a complex space needs to have complexity inside of it in order to react to the complexity outside of it. It's like a balancing act. So there's this idea that you should have lots of variety in the system, but the other side of it is requisite coherence. And requisite coherence is the idea that if everyone is in a Tower of Babel, we're not able to speak or work together, right? So the balancing point here is common ground. And it's like this idea that we need just enough common concepts to make progress, not maximally, but minimally, in order to preserve the scanning and perceptual abilities of multiple mental models. Anyway.
Yeah, so one of the things is that mental models are a thing that lives for decades. I'd like to see one of them live for centuries. And people add to them with more and more research about the same purpose or about related purposes. So they are not a static picture. But what I was going to say is maybe this event storming that Rebecca and Kenny have described is something that could happen after the humanities part of it has been a photo of it has been taken for the purpose, for a particular purpose, and then the stuff that's underneath, I'll just pop this back on the screen. The stuff that's underneath is where we could do a more special event storming process to figure out what goes there and how it relates to the humanity, the possibilities. So the possibilities are the holes in there and the weaknesses, and the differences in thinking styles as well, which are basically people's philosophical approaches. Probably if you've used personas, you have an idea. A thinking style is not a persona, it is slightly different, and the key there is the same thing that Jabe is saying, is that a particular person is not a horoscope. So many personas are written with the idea that, like, oh yeah, that person's a grumbler, so they're a grumbler on the plane, they're a grumbler when they make a reservation, but they're also a grumbler when they get home from work and when they're in traffic driving around. And I'm like, no. It's just within that context, but also that particular person who's grumbling about the flight or something might be a totally engaged person when they're bringing their toddler along to go to Disneyland. And so I'm helping people see the flexibility and not get overwhelmed by it. I'm currently teaching in my course how to pull together these patterns, and people are like, oh my God, I've got 300 of them, I can't do it. And I'm all like, okay, usually I've got 4,000 of them. It is doable. It's not scary like that. And I'm teaching them how to get through it and not be completely overwhelmed by it. But the idea that we're just doing a little picture, the analogy that I tend to use with the problem space, and I think we're all sort of saying the same philosophy here. is that we are like taking a flashlight, going down a trail, or maybe we're going down a trail in full daylight, and we're exploring what we've got around us, and we're making decisions about whether we want to go explore, what is that tree, or what is that view, or should we take this side trail? But we're learning as we go, and we don't know what's ahead of us, and we don't know where else we might end up. I think in the past several decades, business has been like one person or two companies up ahead forging that trail and everybody else sort of following them. And instead, what we have is the opportunity for everybody to explore a much broader landscape.
Yep.
Matt, I saw a hand up.
Yeah. Well, so I'm gonna have to take us back a little bit from where Indy's taken us, but it feels like it's important to say. So, Jabe, thank you for talking about the three. What did you call them? I can't remember.
Cultures. Is what
right.
Because
actually, design is the interesting bit, isn't it? Because BDD, if it was just the science bit, is just TDD really. That's what that bit is. But the thing that is creative and interesting and fascinates me about BDD is the bit of figuring out what is the next test I need to write, or what are the next tests I need to write, because what is it we even want it to do? Can we all agree on that? And that's the interesting bit, is that gap between like how things are today and how we want them to be. And the thing that also resonates with what Dawn said earlier is this thing that we've noticed is how discomforting this is for groups of people, to force them to really confront their collective ignorance, right? Because generally when they build software, what they were used to was they just kind of like crack on and everything seemed fine, and then they'd get to the end and they'd all go, oh shit, it's not like we thought it was, and people are working late and getting stressed and missing deadlines and stuff. And actually trying to deliberately work out where are the places where you don't know stuff or where you disagree about stuff, it's quite uncomfortable. But the thing that we keep sort of saying to people and noticing is like, wherever there is that, like, I don't agree with you, I'd see it like this. Wherever there's that difference, there's some power there to be harnessed. Like there's some magic about to happen. There's some creative energy in that gap. And it's an interesting thing, because I think people naturally will shy away from it and try and go for all of the stuff that they know already, because that's easy and I'll do that bit, and they shy away from the stuff where there's difference. But actually that's the place where there's sort of creative energy to be harnessed.
Yeah, one of the things that I agree with you. I think that tension that you're talking about, that creative tension, is only present when you have that kind of requisite variety of mental spaces, right? Like people's experiences and perceptions of the world. It's actually when they kind of rub together, creative conflict, productive conflict is terms that I've used in the past with people, that kind of get you actually to move forward and change the things. The other kind of weird thing that I'd love to kind of hear about from BDD people. So like behavior-driven development, I always think one of the other things that designers have a really hard time with is accepting that most design is design-driven behavior. In other words, literally the point of designing something is to change someone's behavior. That's why you're designing something. You want them to change their behavior, right? So you look at like a Fitbit. Why is a Fitbit designed? What's it designed to do? It's designed to change how your behavior is, right? It's not designed to support current behaviors. It's designed to change behaviors. So I'm sure we can think of plenty of examples of design that doesn't change behaviors, but most design changes some behavior in some way. So in which ways, like, can we use the ideas of behavior-driven development to actually just flip that around and say, actually, how do we want the system to change the user's behavior? What's the current behavior like? What would we like the behavior to be? And part of this is just simple, really simple. If you have a very complicated, hard to use system, there's two kind of theories about it. One, you kind of like simplify it, make it silly and simplistic, right? So that people can actually interact with it. But that's by like limiting its features and trying to focus it down. The other one is to actually somehow have a transitionary design where the end user is trained up to the capabilities of the system. And that kind of is design-driven behavior, right? How do we have a set of steps where the user is kind of like, I use Photoshop all the time, right? Like if you don't know how to use Photoshop, you don't know how to use Photoshop. Like it's impossible to understand. It's totally insane. But nobody wants to make Photoshop like silly and make it simplistic. That's not, people who like Photoshop like it the way it is. So what is the process of kind of like using a system to change behavior? I don't know. It's maybe just me playing with the words, but that kind of like design-driven.
Yeah, it reminds me about like my kids just got a new video game, and Kathy Sierra's stuff about making software like video games. So you have those first few levels where really you're just getting trained in how to use the game rather than actually doing anything. I actually don't think, I think that's out of scope of BDD. I think where we step in is when you folks have figured that out and you've got a fairly good idea of what it is you want us to build, and we need to figure out the nitty gritty of exactly what it is you want us to build and how it's going to work.
So that's why I was pointing at BDD as being this kind of Popperian falsification driven thing, right? It's a very correspondence theory idea of the world. And by the way, just so you don't think I'm accusing you guys of like being silly scientists who can't think, like Popper is a radical epistemological anarchist. Like he yeah, exactly. So I'm not accusing you of anything other than being really interesting. But it's a certain way of thinking about the world that I think is interesting. Anyway.
And so Dawn and Indy, I see both your hands up. I just wonder on what Jabe's talking about there, Matt, whether it's worth talking about, I guess, the mental model of behavior-driven design and this thing about rules and examples to show how we take the behavior to drive the development of the software and what that might, and maybe we can then riff on what that might mean for taking behavior to drive design in the way Jabe was talking about.
One of the, I don't know that I'll ever see this, maybe at the very end of my lifetime, but what I'd like to see, was it Matt just referenced Kathy Sierra's game design and software design. What I would love to see is software, not like game levels, like you're level 2, you're level 3, but by thinking style, so that a piece of software algorithms can sense as they begin working with a person, which thinking style that person is currently in, and serve them to that thinking style, and then sense if they're in a different thinking style and hand them over to a different algorithm, or sense if they're like, wow, you're like in a different mental space entirely, or your thinking style is not known to us, and to admit that and say, hey, listen, I'm going to try working with you here at this sort of way of working with you, but I don't think I understand your way of moving through the world, and have that chance at the beginning for the algorithm and the software to form a relationship, and to build a different way of working together based on what that relationship is. So that was the Kathy Sierra thing that by the way, I briefly popped up a slide because what Jabe was talking about with respect to epistemology, I have a slide because half the people that we work with, not you guys, but half the people we work with don't know what these words mean. They don't know the background. They don't know the 3 cultures. They don't know that there's more than just one way to build knowledge, that there's only deductive testing, and that, I've got to figure out a theory by pulling it out of the thin air and test it. They don't understand that. And a lot of the, and I don't want us, when I teach people, I'm like, okay, even though we don't know these, they don't know these words, we can know these words and start to see, like what Kenny's wife is doing, start to see what's happening in between when we're working with our teams, and speak to that, right? And work with them that way, by recognizing that and changing our way of working with them so that we recognize that. And part of the thing that I see happening with doing that kind of change, doing that humble sort of change to work with somebody the way that they see the world, is that you can start giving them the feeling of feeling heard. And when they feel heard, they begin to trust you. And that's how trust builds. When they start to trust you and you build that relationship over time, they will start listening to you as well, unless they're a narcissist. And they're out there. And so you just have to know when to give up. But in other cases, it's like everybody's in tears. Everybody's all like, oh my God, this is so much better than it was 3 months ago when we were trying to work together. Now we trust each other. There's a real thing underneath here, and that's how it's built, is to kind of recognize where another person is coming from. But I think all of you are already saying this, and this is what's like underlying what Kenny and Rebecca are saying with respect to what you guys are doing with event storming. Is that right? That's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
So I'm just gonna,
Yeah, go to Seb. He's raising his hand. So.
Well, I've had Dawn's hand up for a little while, so I'm going to go to Dawn and then bring Seb in, if that's okay.
Yep.
I wanted to just add a couple of things. That friction that Jade talked about was that electricity, that thing, it's energy. And you can generate it, but there is, it's kind of ironic. There is a structure to generating the energy, and it only appears in certain conditions and environments, but it's very picky, and we haven't figured out how to package it. And I think in some ways that's a good thing, because then we'd never go searching for it. There'd be nothing new. That's one. And then the other thing I just wanted to share that Indy was talking about is that there's multiplicity in everything, even in terms of thinking styles. That thinking styles don't just apply to a person. One person is multitude. And that thing with the traveling, I commute every week between Munich and Denmark. So when I'm commuting, literally put my body in a hose and shoot me there. I would be happy. When I'm traveling and I want the experience and take everything, completely different kind of person. And I think these practices are helping us to remember that is the reality that we live in. The one we model is everybody is a block of wood and they have 6 sides and that's it. So it's continually reminding us that that's not the truth, no matter how many times that we're going to say it. And then I'll pass over to Seb.
So Matt did a great job of explaining BDD. It feels like a long time ago now. And then we've had a lot of things that have been shared, and Jade made the somewhat lighthearted comment about behavior-driven development and design-driven behavior. So there's something though that the practice of BDD includes a process that we call discovery. Unfortunately, that's another overladen word, but it's about talking to people and listening and asking questions in a structured way. A question that I don't want to pose right now, but if we ever get a chance, is where BDD would fit into Indy's diagram that she showed us on the first slide. The example mapping would fit into that space there. But what I wanted to point out was that the behavior that drives the development in BDD is behavior that has already been thought about and learned by speaking. We hope product owners and managers and owners have spoken to their customers and done all of the great design thinking up front. When it comes in and we get collaboration, we get in the example mapping or the discovery workshops, we get collaboration between product owners, between customers, between developers and architects and testers. They're all asking important questions in their own, from their own perspectives. So what we've got is the diversity that I think we were talking about. Dawn was mentioning people feeling uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable situation because everyone's trying to get their own angle expressed and learn from the other people. But to specifically to Jabe's point, one of the things that frequently comes out of this activity is that the designers change their understanding of the behavior, because by the people who understand the technical aspects of solving the system, asking them questions, it surfaces both sides' assumptions or unknowns, and it can lead to changes in the design. This is a good thing. So I wonder if that fits in slightly into your third culture, and it's in there in example mapping. And we should definitely ask or recommend that lots of people look at Matt's excellent blog post from so many years ago called Introducing Example Mapping, because although as Indy's diagram shows, there are many, many, many ways of learning things from other people. Example mapping is a structured technique that, while not being very exciting maybe from an anthropological point of view to explain, it just returns results super fast with all sorts of people, including developers and testers who have one sort of brain activity. Just really worth looking at.
Yeah. So Seb, just my take on this, right? Like, I think one of the things that happens a lot in design, thinking about design of software, is that we're always thinking the user is the consumer of the system. Yeah. I think that a lot of DDD, BDD, things like this, the thing that's hidden is that one of the things that a system needs to be designed for is the people who are building it. Yeah, I mean, design for manufacture, design for production, all of these things are very commonly understood concepts outside of software engineering for whatever reason, right? In software engineering, this idea of this third culture of design, BDD clearly, very critically supports that concept. But what I think it's designing for is for developers and the teams who are interacting with the system to produce the system. And why I'm pointing out is two reasons. One is to point out this idea of this other user, which I think everybody on this call would recognize as being obvious. But the other side of it is this: if you accept this ontological concept, right, this idea that what we perceive to be possible is shaped by what models we choose to accept through consensus or whatever formats you want to think of coming to accept them. How do we create common ground? Limits what the system, what we can imagine the system could possibly do. Yeah. So it's actually the design of the BDD style is shaping what is actually possible for the end user to ever be able to achieve, because it's shaping what the developers of the system perceive as being possible to develop. And so BDD and all these things, one of the ways I might, try to poke at it is to say, hey, it's important to never think this is the right answer, but this is the current agreement, and that it can be reshaped at any point, and and all of these exercises are exercises that allow us to keep the system plastic and not brittle and static. And so that would be, to me, using this third culture idea. So first culture, obviously science, nothing ever changes. That's the whole point of science. Foundational principles, once you discover it, it's true, right? Second principle assumes that the humanities are based on a Western concept of what humans are, and therefore they believe that there's only one way to be human. Not true. This is why the Western canon is failing currently, and why all humanities departments in every university are currently failing, because they believe there's one way to be a human. The final one, design, is this: how do we keep on keeping the system plastic and moving and adapting for not just the end user, but the people who must produce and live in it. So, it's this stupid idea of the difference between, like, an architect is someone who stamps something according to the official policies, and an architect who says, hey, I'm building something that people have to live inside of for the rest of their lives. Software, we need to be better at understanding that we're building a system that people's minds have to live inside of for a large part of their career. And that's what we should be trying to use that third culture.
In which case, BDD absolutely fits into that third culture. So yeah, it's not science, it's not humanity, it's about ensuring that there's an understanding, everyone changes on both sides, and then the final artifact is documentation that doesn't prescribe what the model should be and supports evolution and modification of that model over time.
That's right. And so the only thing I'd correct is that it's all three models. It's important to expand it to include the third model, right? It uses It uses the scientific correspondence theory. That's the testing automated example stuff. And it's not bad. It's fine. It uses humanities and anthropological thinking to try to get people to understand, like, how do people currently perceive the world? How do we make the system coherent with the way they currently perceive things? And it uses the third one, which says, how do we interact with people to shape and change the way they perceive the system so that other systems could be possible in the future? It's all three, not just one. Yeah.
So, Jabe, I would agree with that. And I would say that, you know, there's one of the core ideas in domain-driven design, which I think piggybacks or aligns well with behavior-driven development, is the idea of supple design. And in encoding a model in the software that is comprehensible by the people that are going to be working on that software, so that the intention is clear and that the assumption is that it's an iterative design process, that the initial models that you come up with are naive and superficial, as Eric Evans said, and that over time you open up new possibilities and you explore new possibilities by enhancing the language. I mean, I think about one of the examples I use when I teach DDD is if you go to, you have the notion of a trade language like Pidgin English. In Vanuatu, if you wanted to talk about what we would call a piano, it's a big black box and we got plenty teeth, man beady me cry out. Right, that's what piano, that's how you say piano in Pidgin English in Vanuatu, right? What's going on there? Well, a person to refer to a piano has to describe it. And I see that a lot in software, right? Is if you have a naive model and your language isn't refined yet, then the way that you talk about things is by, you have to describe them. But if you can come up with a concept that expresses that and incorporate it in your model and over time refine that cohesive set of concepts and express them in the software, it opens up new opportunities for ways of thinking about the world and for conceiving what the software might do and the types of problems that it could solve, because you're building a semantic language that allows you to express these ideas and take it in new directions, at least ideally, right? So I'll stop there.
So to pitch in there, what I've hearing, and it reminds me because I went to a corporate anthropology workshop quite a while ago, and they come up with this model. So normally anthropology is only about what's now, right? So cultural anthropology is what is it now, and they came up with a model, and I'll pop it on the screen, and I find it really interesting. Two women in the Netherlands came up with it. So it's still Dutch. There's an English one, but I'll translate it a bit. Let me pop my screen open.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, I think so too, right? So you should be
Yeah,
able to see
I
it
didn't
now.
understand Dutch. Just keep it in Dutch.
Oh no, just you see it on the screen now?
It's English. Oh, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the model, and you might see stuff. So in the bottom side, it's the concrete stuff, and the upper side is the abstract part, and the left side is the present, and the right side is the future. So in the bottom left, anthropologists call it emic. You just go in and you let me move this around. You find out micro stories, informal interviews, participant observation, and there's where the customer question usually is in corporate anthropology. So in the upper left one, and I think you talked about it, you came up with the patterns. So it's called grounded theory. So don't ask me about that. I'm not that into it. But what happens there is where anthropology stops there. In the middle is where corporate anthropology goes on, and they go to the bottom right or the top right, where they try to, how are we going to change it? Which way are we going? And in the bottom right, you actually do the change. So it really reminded me of, of this model, which was in Dutch, but
can you send it out?
Yeah, I will send.
Okay.
Well, the book is actually in translated in English, but I couldn't find the English one now.
Okay,
so
when you have a chance, yeah, send a link.
Yeah, I'll send
Thanks.
the link in the chat. So it's really interesting how they take cultural anthropology into the corporate anthropology world, where they go out and they say, well, everything we do in the corporate world is already long and wide solutions in the cultural anthropology. So they take all these interesting stories from ancient and current cultures into the corporate world. It's really fascinating if you read it.
So one of the things I'd point out really quickly, because I'm really interested in this problem, right, is like most people tend to think, I shouldn't say most people, a lot of people tend to think like the reason to keep the system well maintained and malleable and all this kind of things, especially these days, especially DevOps groups and things like this, is because we should assume that we're wrong about something and we need to be able to fix it quickly, right? So there's this built-in assumption that we'll build the wrong thing. And then there's always a tendency to say, oh, well, maybe we should get better at building the right thing, then we'll have both a malleable system and not have to change it quite so much. I think the really critical thing to understand about this kind of, in your model, like, how do we change the world? Maybe software engineers don't all want to change the world, but almost any founder of any company, the first thing they say that I always makes me want to punch myself in the face is, we're going to change the world. Well, listen, if you guys are building stuff that changes the world, you should assume that you're going to have to change the thing itself too, because the parts of the world that are going to change are probably the things closest to the system that you are making. So the better you get at design, the better you'll need to be at design, because literally it spins on itself, right? The more effective the design is at changing behavior, the more the things that are right around the design will change and need to be reflected back in the system. So, there's a loop here that's, a little bit different than Paul's like refining the mental models, because it's not necessarily always refining. It's kind of like updating based on success. Your success will create problems. You will have to update your models because of the new problems. And it will never stop. It will just get faster the better you get at it, right? And that's kind of, I think, one of the things to think through is like the way that you guys get, the way that we get better at design actually causes the flywheel to go faster, not slower. You don't get better and get to slow down or relax. The better you get, the faster the change is.
So I want to bring in a question from the chat right now. So Rinat has asked, how do we incorporate the business management view into the three approaches of scientific, humanity, and design? And I wondered if this was a place to bring Frederick in to talk about continuous design. That's my assumption anyway.
Is business management a thing there?
Yes.
Business/management.
Oh, okay, right. So, okay. I thought business management might be a thing. Right, sorry.
Would be. Yeah, thanks for a nice setup, Jabe. I'm just going to share my screen, and here's a presentation my colleague Maria Skolden made for a big conference in New York we had. The background was that we were working at a Norwegian rail company where everything was changing due to a lot of sector changes. So essentially the whole company was being cut apart and torn to pieces by big changes wrought by government. And we had to re-architect everything. And also the company had to invent new services and new modalities, not just do trains and buses, but also figure out what they're going to be in the future. And it means that in this context, so the developers and the designers all sit together and work with each other. But the question is, what are we supposed to make? And at the same time, we were trying to figure out new pricing models, new products, everything. And it became clear quite quickly that really wasn't useful to come up with big concepts that were going to take a lot of time to actually roll out. We needed something really quickly. There were a lot of things that were broken in what we had. And the approaches that we were essentially forced to create in this context they became pretty useful, because what we did was, we need to figure out what we're doing. We don't have time to do everything. We have lots of teams doing stuff. We need a way to get stuff out there and get feedback. So as you've all been discussing, I've been pondering if this is sort of event storming in production, because the moment we would get a new API, we would open it in Postman and see, and then with the developers and designers, we'd be talking, well, what can we do with this? Can this sort of be jigged and forced to do what we want it to do, or can we make something completely different based on what it actually does? And what we would have project setting, typical Trello setup with stuff coming in. But the big difference was that the whole team would design. So it wasn't that a few people would sit around and decide. It would be everyone from lots of different backgrounds coming up with sketches of, this is what I believe in, because you'd have different competencies working on that. And then the continuous aspect was, we would start with something. We would work on that over time. That would change based on feedback from our users. We would make nicer sketches. We would roll stuff out. The developers would design stuff and build that. And that would be sort of a way to bring stuff out into reality. Maybe this isn't exactly what we want, but it's here and we're getting feedback. Maybe this is a good direction. And one of the things I learned a lot about was that, whenever we would run a usability test, it was best to do it on an actual train in the actual context of use. But we also learned something which was a bit disheartening, and that was, when you're working on something like a pricing model, it's very, very difficult to get an idea of, what will people actually do. Because we built full-scale systems so people could buy tickets at different prices. I would sit with a computer and set the price and set the rules for the tickets. Very nice. But all of the insight was useless because they weren't actually in a purchase situation. So they weren't in the context. And this was complicated because in a lot of business systems that we use, people have a certain activity that they have to do. It doesn't have anything to do with their own motivation. But in this case, people were evaluating all sorts of ways to get, from A to B, like Indy's example. How can I get there? And so it became an unrealistic thing to actually test with, well, if the price is this, how much will they pay? Because they didn't have a real context. If they really needed to get to that meeting or get to that cruise ship on time, then everything would have been different. But the lovely thing was that since we had such a low cost of change, and that's a thing I'm a little curious about in a lot of the contexts that have been discussed here so far, what is the cost of change? Because we had lots of feature toggles and lots of different APIs we could use. I'm not saying it was perfect, but this ability to do stuff, get feedback, discuss it, and get in touch with our users and see, like, what do you actually think about this? I commute on the train, so I would be on the train with people all day long and then see, what do you think? How does this work for you? Does it do the thing it does? The term continuous design is something we got from Jeff Sussna, and he also talks about promises and promise-driven design. He's going to zoom through this whole thing. Well, we got lots of feedback from our users about what we were doing right or wrong. It's a good way to get feedback. But the thing was that there were a lot of broken promises. And this was really hard for us as a digital team because we wanted to do a really good job, but we didn't actually run the trains or the infrastructure. And it was really complicated, as you probably know, with public transit. There are a lot of different actors involved, and you can't control everything. And so the thing is, why do I take the train? Well, I need to get my kid on time. And really these heartbreaking stories of, parents struggling to get home on time, trying to find a neighbor who could go pick up their kid in kindergarten. And that's the sort of this pain that we as a development team would feel, and wondering, what can we do about this? And obviously we couldn't upgrade the network rail infrastructure. We couldn't buy new trains, but we could try to get the best information available. So in a lot of cases, we had to sort of build new ways of getting information, new routines. And in many ways, that was just only a small part of that was doing software. So this is when we have a thing called bus for train. So the train isn't running. So you're going to be taking a bus instead. What do we do? How can we give you the right information? How does this help you or hurt you? Like one of the panelists today had difficulties getting here on time because of a rail situation. So one of the interesting things was that we needed to change everything on the back end without anybody seeing anything. But the ability then, after changing to lots of new infrastructure and continuous development and deployment, meant that we could always be sending out a new service. And then introduced a lot of things which for me was very useful from a Cinnamon point of view. And that's the whole idea that we're going to have these feedback loops. We're going to have different kinds of domains where certain things are taking place. There are some things which are really simple. We're just going to do it like that. And then there was more the complex, really unpredictable. How is this going to change things? Like the train is full. How will adding information about how full the train is change how full the train is, right? In what way are people going to shift around in that sense? and lots of experiments to try to figure that out. But the interesting thing for us, I think from a more like general point of view for the purposes of our discussion, is that we got out of this feature factory mode where we were just doing stuff because we had to, and came up with this sort of sense where we would work at two tiers all the time, where on the one hand, we'd be working at, this is sort of where we want to go in the future. And maybe you would make nice sketches and concepts and look at technologies and evaluate, but that wasn't connected to what we were producing. Instead, we would then jump in at a really detailed level and say, okay, let's take just one tiny sliver of that and get that into reality. And then over time, we would learn and get feedback. And so I am beginning to suspect that this is sort of event storming in production. So we would always then be talking about, we're doing this, we're doing a really bad version of it, but we're going to be doing a better version of it later. We're going to get feedback. And for me, having worked in sort of an agile setting since 2005, it's such a great way to work where we can change things quickly. We don't have to have a super clear idea about things. We have certain things which are, you know, your ticket is actually valid and actually works and so on. But for me, that's an approach which I'm curious if others are also using. Is it, you know, locked into a culture of high trust among teams, among customers? It'd be really interesting to get your input or reflections on that. Is this a way that you all work? Is it a familiar way to you?
Okay.
So, Frederick, it was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing. The first thing that I would I'd think about is actually this very last slide. And the thing that I think you might enjoy looking at is Elliot Jack's concepts of time spans. And the way that I tend to use it is this. My really simple dumbed down version is this. Everybody in your business tends to get to tell, if someone says, what are you doing right now? They get about, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes to tell a story about what they're doing this week, next week, what they're doing with their lives, what they do in their job. So if you're in a development team, especially if you do modern agile development style stuff, maybe you do 2-week sprints or a flow-based thing, but you've got a pretty compressed time frame. And therefore, your answer will probably be full of details similar to the type of stuff you're talking about here, like this is what I'm doing, and hey, you know, great things like, hey, we've lowered our cost of change, so I can do more of these things and more experiments, right? Usually in the middle management layer, you get the same thing, right? Like, but they're gonna have to tell you a quarter-long story, a story that lasts for 3 months, right? Notice they don't get more time, right? So they still get 5 to 10 minutes. It means that what's in those stories can't be the same thing that are in the development team stories, yeah? And then you go up one more level, you go up to executive management or C-level. You know, these guys are talking a year long, a year and a half, 5 years. I very rarely ever hear anybody tell a coherent 5-year story, but that's a whole other thing. But the stories are longer, and they also only get, maybe they get 20 minutes because they're the boss, right? But still, it's compressed, so their stories can't contain the same things either. So one of the things to kind of notice about like change and the cost of change is that the time frame of change changes itself. So for instance, if you're an executive, you get to broadcast a message about what we're going to do for the next 2 to 3 years. But if you changed that story every 2 weeks, how long would people follow you? The cost of change as an executive is completely different than the cost of change of a development team. Yeah. And this concept is in Jack's language is called your time span of discretion. And your time span of discretion is really easy to find. It says, how long can you do something before your boss comes and asks you to show him or her what you've been doing? Yeah. And that determines your time span of discretion. Obviously, most Scrum-based teams is 2 weeks is the exact answer. Again, middle management's, maybe 2 quarters, a quarter, but trying to understand how those things fit together and where your cost of change efforts are kind of focused in there, I think are really interesting. And I would say just generally, one of the things that has been not a great result of Agile is that almost everyone has tried to compress all their narratives down into these 2-week timeframes so that it looks like everyone's aligned in the same space. Like we're all telling the same kind of story. And that's the exact wrong, that's that diversity problem that we have, right? And part of the cost of that is architecture in particular. Like, we're only allowed to talk about evolutionary or incremental architecture. We're not allowed to have bigger, longer term views. And that has a significant cost of change at the team level. That's super frustrating to me. Anyway, so that's my really quick kind of reflections on some of the stuff you were saying. I think one of the big things that I push right now is exactly where you're going, though. Cost of change is a huge transformation issue in most organizations. We need to get better at it, and we need to have a better language for it, for sure, definitely.
So I see in the chat that John has mentioned a fun tool for thinking about this, which he's called a network of nested bets. I wonder if it'd be nice to hear something about that for everybody.
Oh, okay. No, what James said reminded me. One activity I do a lot with teams. I'll just tell a story. I did an activity recently where I went into a company and we had a large room. And it was like 100 feet or more by 50 feet. And the first thing I did is I printed every single JIRA ticket in the system. So there was about 2,000 or 3,000 of them. And we laid those out in a beautiful, like, just to show people what was going on. We laid them out in a beautiful grid on the floor. So it was like, 3,000 index cards on the floor. And to Jabe's point, the next question was like, okay, well, all these are about 1 to 3 hours or 1 to 3 days or 1 to 3 weeks worth of work. Usually 1 to 3 days or actually this organization, 1 to 3 days, 1 to 3 hours. They happen to be actually pretty good at doing what you're supposed to do, make everything really small. And so we started the activity of going from those 2,000 things laid on the floor to, the 600 bets in the 1 to 3 week and 1 to 3 month range. And then we went down from the 600 things down to the, whatever, it starts to be 100 odd bets in the 1 to, and we kept going. But the reason why I do this activity is that, just to Jabe's point, if you ask an executive what's a 1 to 3 year bet or a 1 to 3 decade bet, I'm thinking even Wardley mapping now when he's sort of drawing out these large transitions, things that will take, you don't even know the timing, it will take 5 or 10 years. Like that's actually in an executive, will think in terms of that language. But we describe them as bets just to leave it flexible. Like, bets can be short, they can be long, they can be prescriptive. Some games you can bet after the game has started. Sometimes you can, some bets you can bet incrementally, or you can double down. Some are super risky but have a high reward. So it's a very flexible bit of language to use. But anyway, to the point around the time horizon stuff, when you do this exercise, and I think it is actually related to this conversation, is where the shared understanding falls apart is in the messy middle of 1 to 3 quarters or 1 to 3 months, depending on the organization. So these mental models we have, like these missions, these ways we want to create new futures, or I know Jay doesn't like create new futures, explore potential futures, or whatever you're saying. It's all very fractal in that sense. And I think that this is, to Indy's point too, it's like, all this work in that 1 to 3 quarter, 1 to 3 year, 1 to 3 month range is what we need to be doing as well in these activities to kind of fuse together the activities of what we're talking about. So that was, anyway, so the funny thing is I couldn't take a picture of it because if I could just have taken a picture of 3,000 JIRA tickets on one floor, I would be internet famous. So that's, so that's the letdown was not being able to take a picture, but that's the bets in 1 to 3s. But I think it relates to this in that that's just another sense-making activity. It's asking people to describe a nebulous thing called a bet, and then talking about connectivity between ideas and things. So hopefully that helps what I was talking about.
So my one, just to do the third culture version of this really quickly, bets are middle management activities in my mind. And what I mean by that is bets are very first 2 culture issue. They're where do we want to be? The really quick way of saying this to an executive is, do you want to pick where we should end up, or do you know that you can change the game and therefore change what kind of bets we can take?
What's fascinating about that is that to that point, again, there's probably the folks on the call, if we said that bets could be anything, I could make bets that something will emerge. The folks on this call would be like, okay, I get you. But I experienced that exact thing, that in management culture, a bet actually you can't have a passive bet. Like in my mind, a belief in a sense is a bet, right?
Yep.
But I think someone mentioned this earlier in the sort of outside this room and talking to managers, the minute you say bet, they imagine, a do this type bet, or you're going to be the big better. So yeah, use at your own risk, try to modify appropriately.
And realize that one of the things you can do with all the things we're trying to describe is, if you're betting, you can actually change the game. That's one of the things you could do, is change the game. You could change the domain models that allow people to imagine different possibilities. That would change the game, what is possible to bet on, or it could improve the likelihood that you're successful in this particular kind of bet. So again, really high level thing. Executives should be managing the system to enable greater possibilities, not to get a particular possibility. Because when you manage for a particular possibility, you are necessarily narrowing the system down and limiting what its possible futures could be. Middle managers should be the people who are placing bets. They should be the ones who are doing strategy. Like the really dumb version of this, again, for people who don't play sports, I apologize. I don't like sports metaphors either. But basketball coaches don't own teams, stadiums, all that other stuff. The owner of the team does all that stuff, and their job is to increase the options for the coach in particular games. The coach is a middle manager, not an executive. Yeah. And I think it's really kind of critical to kind of make sure that people get the difference, because otherwise you get like a lack of system management. And I think that's a real problem nowadays. People are, if you use that time span analysis, people are basically collapsing down in time span, and therefore thinking their role is to actually do strategy as opposed to manage the system. And that's causing problems. Sorry, Durant.
So Indy, you've had your hand up for a little while. Do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, the one thing that I thought I was going to be the one that gets to say fractal first, but John beat me to it. All the things that we're talking about here kind of fit together fractally. Somebody asked me, well, how does it fit on this little diagram that I had? And you could, if you wanted, try to show how it fits over, like the BDD might fit in those overlapping cycles that happen. This is a simplified version of what's happening in the solution space. But if we think of it more fractally, it's like as we go through time at different levels of time, we're doing different versions of this at once. Part of the thing that I do with listening to understand different groups of people achieving different purposes happens divorced from the solution. So there might already be a solution out there, or there may be just the germ of an idea of a solution is possible, and we want to know more. And so, like as you wander down time, we're maybe reaching for a lot of these tools, not all at the same time, but one after the other, within the size of the different thing that we're trying to get done, whether it's small or whether it's a little bit larger, and whether it's being led by a middle manager who is able to embrace the ambiguity and keep their mind open to the different possibilities that design can bring to the table. I don't know, does that help? Dawn?
Yep. Yeah, what I was going to say, so kind of going back to what Frederick showed, and I think this is another symptom of what I've seen, and it's kind of empirical, is this drive that we have to make everything one and the same. So you've touched it, Jabe, with the time everybody's shifting to a sprint. In the Olympics, we don't just have the sprints. We have marathon, we have 400, 200, everything. But somehow, when it comes to our ordinary lives, we always want to collapse it down to the one. Frederick, what you said about having that two system, is something that I've always practiced as a developer, now as a designer, because people very easily shift between all the possibilities in their mind. But if you're not clear about what you're talking about, then that's the Babel factor that you talked about, Jabe. So now I insist that we have one thing that we call North Star. That's the thing that is the possible, our aim. That's us us planting our flag on the moon. That's how I describe it. And then we're taking little baby steps, chunks, and it's going to look like hell because we're running around and we're going to try something and it might work, and then we build a rocket. And so we have this concept of the North Star and then what we're working on. And it's a way for me to manage that tension and for people to be comfortable that they don't match at all. But I can't get away with making North Star not related at all to what we're doing. I think I would be lynched because that's a step too far. But this needs to collapse everything down to one. It's not just what is known, but it's uniform. It's the same. It's works exactly the same in a situation. It's something that I see. I don't know what it is, but this is where we go wrong, whether it's software, whether it's architecture, whether it's a bunch of things. And that's the thing that keeps me curious and looking and trying to figure out. So indeed, that's my thing. Just like your thing is the system that would sense what thinking stuff. For me, if we could solve that, then that would be amazing. So I think that your model about having concurrent, so think about the ideas and the possible, even in a limited way, and be working on it, learning from it, expand your understanding, and then reflect it back, and that's going to change. And then they don't even have to move in parallel, but you always have to have those two. Then I think fosters innovation. That's what I've found. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. And I love the way you just said it. And I would say the three, because when I wrote down the title of a file I was saving for my notes, I go DDD, BDD, and MMD. I'm like, wow.
What is MMD?
Mental model diagram.
Oh, okay.
So we're getting close to 9 o'clock my time, but the end time for everybody. And I think it'd be great for us to come to a close. And suggestion from Kenny is that maybe like we all came here to see what we could learn from each other's disciplines and things. So maybe in a sentence or two, we could all say, what we're going to change tomorrow or go and look at tomorrow to kind of, based on this conversation, what ideas have been sparked from this.
You want to call them out? Makes it easier.
Yeah, I'll definitely call them out. I'll go reverse order from in my screen of people, which unfortunately puts you first, John.
I'm going to take Jabe's point about the three cultures, I think, and specifically for my work, I work in a company that does product analytics, and so a big discussion for us is how we sort of enable the possible versus just understanding what's happening right now in the product. And I think that I need to take that dialogue to our company, because I think we help along that path, but thinking that just sort of, measuring what's happening right now is going to give you the possible future is something that especially Silicon Valley falls into the trap of, and so I want to try to bring that message with me.
Michael?
Thanks, Jabe. I always love hearing your framings of things. I'll take the third culture and Don's piece about not focusing on what you're doing now, just to keep that open. Because, yeah, we've got to turn widgets and cranks and all, but why are we doing this? It's been inspirational for me because I'm just so tired of, not another damn widget. That's kind of the definition of postal. The guy got crazy because mail was always coming at him.
Rob?
Yeah, for me, again, the cost of change idea was fascinating in terms of hierarchy and the time span associated within an organization. I thought that was fascinating. I hadn't thought about it that way. So certainly something to think about. Thanks, Jabe. I think it was a brought it up.
Seb.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely reading to be done. I've noted down a number of things, most of which obviously I won't read. That just goes without saying. But yeah, some great diagrams. I'm going to be definitely looking at what Indy shared. I would love to have another look at what Frederick shared, if that's available somewhere on the public interweb. Yeah, I think that's plenty for starters.
Yeah, I mean, just before we go to Frederick, Kenny, I guess we'll be able to get all the resources and things and put them up on the kind of show notes page afterwards for this, right?
Yeah, so I've tried to, I got all the links in the chat, but I'll send an email for everyone to send in more and we'll get it on the YouTube video afterwards.
Great, thank you.
I see a button that says save chat. That might be helpful.
Yeah.
Or is it? You don't know what that does.
It saves it to your Zoom folder. So
if you're recording this Zoom thing, it will it'll show up in your Zoom recordings page as chat, audio, and video.
Right. So Frederick.
Thank you. It was great. What I'm going to be more conscious of tomorrow is at what time span, with regards to Elliot Jack, is the person I'm speaking with operating? Because I jump through, up and down, middle management, top management, development teams. And I think it's going to be very useful for me to mentally just check, at what time span are we speaking about here? What's burning, what's not, what's on the horizon, so we can put the conversation at the right level in the right place. I think that's going to be really useful. So thank you.
Indy?
Okay, there we go. I am wanting to read the stuff that Frederick brought up as well, maybe that book. I'm really interested in the three cultures because I teach people how awareness, right? Self-awareness and awareness of the words they use and awareness of the other things. One of the things I'm going to be doing this year is research about how people interact with their stakeholders. All of you guys do that. I don't personally, because I'm just doing the research. So when I get that out, I want to, I maybe, when I start that study, focusing or shaping it a little bit by some of the things that I've learned here. So I'll want to be connecting with you guys all again.
Matt.
Of everybody here, Indy intrigues me the most because I understood the least of what you were saying. So you're the most likely person I'm going to be kind of reading all of your stuff and bothering you for more things afterwards. Three cultures is again, like was a good, like, sticky idea that will stay with me. The other thing I want to say thanks for is Dawn. This idea of challenging people to come up with impossible ideas, I just think is brilliant, and I can't wait to try it. Thank you.
Rebecca?
You're muted, Rebecca.
So one of the things that I'm going to do is listen to this recording, and one of the missions that I've been on lately is hunting for heuristics. And I want to take what you have said, all of you, and sort of map it into things that I would state as the heuristics you have for finding knowledge, for making forward progress, for understanding and interpreting and sense making, like different timescales or whatever, and just see what I come up with. And to that effect, I think that changing the world and design is a very interesting idea that we're not just in this little bubble of we poke on something and then it changes us while we do that. So that kind of thinking about design is something that is going to resonate with me. So we'll see what I come up with, but a lot of interesting ideas that I heard.
Thanks. Kenny?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things I've heard, especially the three cultures popped in, and definitely the thing Indy went in. But one thing that popped my mind is what every time came back is people not seeing the user perspective. So on my wedding, and it reminds me of my wedding where we printed out 2 cardboards, real side cardboards of my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law, because they were the ones organizing it, and put it at the front. So I might just go to customers and print out real life cardboards for people, just put it in the room while they're designed so that they can watch to the user. So I might just start there, really simple. Just throw it in their face. This is your user. Because I think that if we just start by that, it's going to be a whole different path.
And Dawn?
I think a couple of things for me. This has been an amazing, amazing time. And thank you, John, again, for instigating this. And I hope that maybe we can do this again in a month or 2. What this has done is confirmed some things that I'm doing, and I'll keep doing because I'm not crazy, like the 2 lanes, if you like. And always what you said about always looking for the possible, because people always, we don't have time, we've got things that we need to do and all of that, but making time for that. And then reading up a bit more about design-driven development. So you talked about event storming. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other things that would be interesting to start to do intersections and think about. And I think, just the third thing is I haven't spoken to Indy for a while, and today it just reminded me, and I'm kicking myself. I'm like, okay, I'm definitely going to make sure we'll make some time and catch up, because we've been looking at people's motivation and thinking styles. I'm going to pick that back up again. So those are the 2 things I'm going to do, reinforcement that I got out of this conversation.
The Thinking Styles course is going to begin the middle of February.
All right, I'll talk to you anyway. So
okay.
And Jabe?
First of all, thanks again for putting such an amazing group of people in the same virtual space for 2 hours. What an honor to kind of be included and maybe ranting at you all while you patiently listen. Thank you for that. There's a couple things. The first thing is this: I teach at CMU. I teach a class on worldviews, and I teach a class on the history of systems thinking. And one of the things that I would like to do based on this conversation is get a little bit sharper understanding of the difference between a mental model, a worldview, a frame. There's some really interesting kind of differentiations in there that I think I find I lecture about it in public quite frequently, and I find myself using them synonymously when I probably shouldn't be. So really want to do the research to be able to make sure that I'm using those terms correctly. Indy gave me a nice little pointer that mental models last for a long time. So that I think is very interesting. Anyway, so some terminological research that I think I need to do to make sure I have a better kind of understanding of that. The second thing that I was thinking a lot about that I want to try to think through a little bit more is event storming, specifically from this philosopher Alain Badiou's idea of what an event is. For him, an event is basically this idea that there's kind of something that's happening and the perception of what's happening, and the event is when the difference between what's happening and the perception gets so great that it collapses the perception down into an actual perception of reality. So this is partially about power dynamics. It's partially about people being able to argue this is what's really happening when that's not what's really happening, and the power allowing a group of individuals to drift away from reality until the event, which is called a collapse back to reality. And I'm kind of interested and wondering about whether or not events in event mapping or event storming might be these kind of like touch points where the system has to kind of sync back to reality in a way. And how does that work? I'm interested in that. By the way, my PhD is about time in design. So like event storming is definitely one of my interests in life. Anyway, that's what I'd be interested in playing with more.
Cool. Well, I mean, I just want to say thank you so much, everybody. It's been a real privilege to be here listening to this conversation and trying to herd the cats a little to get everyone a chance to speak their mind. I mean, for me,
you did a great job, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn.
Yay!
I mean, for me, the thing that in my current role, so I've just gone from I'm a developer by what's the word I'm looking for? I self-identify as a computer programmer, but I've been a co-founder of a startup, and now I'm working as a product manager in a medium-sized company, and it's really exciting to me that there's all these confluences of ideas coming from everywhere that I need to look at, and for me, the continuous design things that Frederick talked about is like hitting right in the sweet spot of what I'm trying to do with our team are trying to do right now, what we're trying to do. So I'm just it really having the language to talk about that is going to really help me. So that was wonderful for me. Thank you. Kenny, do you want to wrap up from the host point of view?
Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining this stream live. Hope you all enjoyed. Thank you, Steve, for being our host today, our guest host. And thank you for the rest for coming in and joining. So for you who not heard about event storming, Tuesday we'll have another virtual DDD, and we're going to do some live event storming on stream. We go against Alberto's wish because we never want to do it online, but well, people's been asking for it, so we're going to do it. In 3 weeks, we'll be at DDD Europe, trying to get all your feedback, trying to grow this community even further. And I hope to see you next time. And watch out for the podcast coming live tomorrow about this event. Thank you all, and goodbye.